28 days after the Lutz family moved into their dream house. They were running for their lives. What happened to them is an experience in terror you will never forget, and you will believe in the Amityville Horror.
The story of the Amityville Horror is so well known, it's basically become part of American folklore. A year after a gruesome mass murder took place at 112 Ocean Avenue, a couple named George and Kathleen Lutz bought the big house for well below market value. But soon terrifying, unexplained events began occurring, hinting at a malevolent, evil presence that had possessed the previous owner, Ronald DeFeo Jr., to kill his entire family. This malevolent spirit forces the family to flee the house, fearing for their lives. Spoiler alert, it was all a hoax. Well, the alleged haunting and possession were hoaxes. The DeFeo murders, however, were very much real. So let's get into that. Ronald DeFeo Jr., known as Butch to his friends and family, was the oldest of the 5 children born to Ronald Sr. and Louise DeFeo. Friends and neighbors described the DeFeo family as loud and quarrelsome, and Ronald Sr. as abusive. It's not surprising that in that kind of environment, Butch began acting out at an early age. And in fact, at age 13, he attacked his own grandfather and got sent to his child psychologist, though I don't really think it took. So Ronald's father, Butch's grandfather, owned a successful car dealership in Brooklyn and at one point gave Ronald a well-paying job there. With that money, in 1965, the family bought the large Dutch colonial house on 112 Ocean Avenue in the upscale suburb of Amityville, New York. Louise christened the property High Hopes and decorated the yard with Catholic shrines. And indeed, it looked like the family wanted for nothing, financially anyway. But in more important areas, things were not much different for the DeFeos at High Hopes. Ronald continued to be abusive. Once, when Louise was coming up from the basement with a load of laundry, he punched her in the face so hard she fell back down the stairs. Butch, who was already troubled, started spiraling out of control. His classmates described him as surly, violent, and a spoiled brat. He dropped out when he was only 17 and would occasionally work at his grandfather's car dealership. But he always seemed to have plenty of money for drugs, booze, and sex. His friends said he had a heroin habit and spent a lot of money on speed and LSD. Apparently, Butch was stealing $500 a week or more from his father and anything else he could get his hands on. Ronald and Butch fought constantly, actually physically fighting. A year before the murders, so in 1973, Butch, who was then 22, pulled a gun on his father and pulled the trigger, but luckily the gun misfired. Now, fast forward to 2 weeks before the murders, so late October 1974. Butch and a coworker at the car dealership were sent to make a deposit for the business with cash and checks worth several $1,000s. Well, they didn't return for more than 2 hours. They claimed they'd been robbed, but their story fell apart pretty quickly. Neither one of them could give a coherent description of the person who robbed them, and they couldn't account for where they'd been for the 2 hours they were gone. When he was questioned, Butch was combative and uncooperative with the officers, a sure sign of innocence. Ronald, though, knew what was up, and he was furious. So on November 8th, the Friday before the murders, Ronald confronted Butch at the car dealership, and of course, it was a huge blowout fight. Butch screamed, "You fat prick, I'll kill you," before jumping into his car and speeding off. So 5 days later, on the evening of November 13th, 1974, Butch ran into Henry's bar, which was just a few blocks away from his house, yelling that his family had been shot. So him and several of his friends who he'd been hanging out with at the bar ran back to the house. When they looked inside and saw bodies, they called the police. Inside, the police found the rest of the DeFeo family, all of them face down in their beds, shot to death with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. Ronald and Louise had each been shot twice. 7-year-old John and 12-year-old Mark, as well as 13-year-old Allison, had been shot one time in the head. Only 18-year-old Dawn looked as though she had actually been awake when she was shot. She was found in her room in the attic. And right away, investigators noticed some inconsistencies with Butch's story. The medical examiner found that the DeFeo family had been dead since around 3 a.m. or 3:15 if you believe the Lutzes. That was nearly 15 hours before Butch burst into the bar asking for help. So at the station, Butch said that he had gone into his grandfather's car dealership to work that morning, but there wasn't really much work for him to do, so he went home around lunchtime. He said when he got home, he realized he'd forgotten his key, so he was locked out. There was no one to let him in, so he decided to go to Henry's bar and just hang out for the rest of the afternoon. He said it was only when he returned home that evening that he found his family murdered. He insisted, though, that this had been a mob hit. He claimed that his father had been doing business with organized crime and had somehow botched some kind of job, and this was retaliation. Under questioning, Butch's story would kind of change every time, but always it included the mob hitman. But eventually he broke down and confessed. He said, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He told police that after he'd murdered his family, he changed out of his bloody clothes and took a shower. Then he collected up all the cartridges, wrapped up the rifle, the bloody clothes, and everything in a pillowcase. He then took all that stuff with him and drove to Brooklyn. He first dropped the rifle and the clothes off the end of a dock at the end of his street, and then he hid the cartridges in a drain somewhere in Brooklyn. He then went to work as though nothing had happened. He did indeed leave around lunchtime, as he said, but he went to his girlfriend's house, and he spent the afternoon there hanging out with friends, drinking, and doing heroin. Throughout the day, he would call home and, of course, get no answer. So after he and his group of friends went to Henry's bar, Butch acted like he was worried and said he was going to go home and break a window to get in and see what was going on. He left, and then just a few minutes later, not really enough time for him to have walked all the way home and then all the way back to the bar. But he came back, and that's when he burst in yelling that his family had been shot. He was charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. At his trial, Butch tried for an insanity plea. He had been evaluated by several court psychiatrists, but they were divided over whether or not he was insane at the time of the murders. When he was on the stand, he gave wildly varying accounts of what happened, and that was when he started claiming he heard voices and was possessed by Satan. That was the testimony the Lutzes used to prove their claims about the house. And it almost worked. The first jury came back 10-2, with 2 jurors unsure about his mental state at the time of the murders. But then after they read through the transcripts, they came back with a unanimous verdict. On November 21st, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty on all 6 counts of second-degree murder. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to 25 years to life. He was incarcerated in the Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, and while he was there, he got married 3 times. In the 45 years since his conviction, Butch has given several different explanations for the murders, including one version where Dawn actually shot everyone and then he had to shoot her in self-defense. There was another version that said he, Dawn, and 2 other friends were the ones who actually murdered everyone. Anyway, he died on March 2nd, 2021, when he was 69 years old. They still haven't released his cause of death, but I think we can take an educated guess. The subsequent owners of the house, the Lutzes, along with self-proclaimed demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, fabricated this whole story about the strange and dangerous phenomena forcing them out of the house. Their story inspired author Jay Anson to write the Amityville Horror, which went on to become one of the best-selling horror novels of all time. even though it was originally billed as nonfiction. The book was then adapted into a blockbuster movie that came out in 1979, which itself spawned an entire franchise, most of which were direct-to-video, the mark of quality. After that, the house on 112 Ocean Avenue became known as the most famous haunted house in America, and it played a bit part in another murder a decade later committed by the Acid King, Ricky Kasso. It's since been renovated and given a new address in an effort to stem the tide of curious onlookers. None of the subsequent owners have reported any unexplained phenomena. And the town of Amityville seems to want to put the whole thing behind them, both the DeFeo murders and the subsequent haunting hoax. So what do you think about the DeFeo murders and the Amityville Horror hoax? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to help me make more nerdy content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description. Till next time, Darklings!